Tim Keller once, and you all know I love Tim Keller, he's one of my favorites, but he once stated the gospel has two aims. The first aim is confronting the sin that's in the world, the thing that masters this world that we live in, the evilness that is there. But then the other objective of the gospel is to confront the idols that are in our lives. And we've had this discussion before, and today I want to kind of pull on some of what we discussed in times past to address a potential idol that many of us may have in our hearts, or maybe we could have in our hearts if we're not careful. And unless we address with the gospel, we'll fall ourselves or push ourselves, if you will, into serving this idol without any limitations. And the way I want us to think about this is to consider the premise that I will use to gauge this study, or I should say build this study out as we discuss it. And it is simply this, and this is what I want us to think about as we read through these passages, because it's such a big issue in our lives if we're not careful. It is the reality of failure. Failure is often the means by which we are tempted to elevate something or someone above God. And I want to talk about this reality that we all face that could push us to commit idolatry even if we don't intend to do so. I don't know about you guys, but I am becoming a big fan of a place called Starbucks. And it's such a big thing in our family that now my daughter is a fan of Starbucks at her young age of 8 years old. And we often stop by there if we're traveling or on the road for different things. But I was looking at this company, and it was started by a man named Howard Schultz. And like many successful people, he found success in this company by failing. The story goes that Howard was rejected 200 times before he actually received funding to expand Starbucks and other coffee ventures that he had before. It shows that he could get no support, he could get no help, and he was even at moments in his life forced to give his blood in exchange for money in order to make ends meet. But because of his failure and because of the things he suffered trying to get this company to where it needed to be, he became obsessively committed to the success of the coffee business and quite frankly, coffee industry in general. And as you know, the story goes that Starbucks became one of the most successful businesses of our time. In fact, Shaquille O'Neal, in the interview, they asked him, what was one of your greatest failures do you believe you experienced in your life? He says it was not investing in Starbucks. He said, I had an opportunity. I was at the table, and they gave me an offer, and I said, no one will drink coffee in the way that you think, and so I turned it down. What I want you to see here in this story, and it is an absolute inspirational story in that it shows what hard work and resilience and perseverance and committing yourself to a thing will do, and I believe in all of that. I believe that as human beings, we should commit ourselves to whatever it is we have been called to with all we have. But I want us to understand the difference between committing in a noble way and using failure as a means of creating idols in our life. Because there are many people in the world who, through their failures, they become so obsessed with a thing or with achieving success that they forget God. And this is the first principle I want to give you as we think through these topics. The first thing is this: your last failure, whatever that may have been, does not make you any less or any more valuable to God. You have to accept this reality, or else you will create an idol out of perfection or success. This is what we learn through Scripture, and we're going to learn through a further investigation today, that our last failure, whatever that may have been, does not give us the ability to impact or define our identity. Tim Keller addressed this issue through what is called the self-constructed identity. It is an identity that we build based on a few factors. And it's not necessarily motivated by things we read in Scripture or what we feel or hear from God. It's rather what we make of ourselves based on our own experiences, our choices, our relationships, and our cultural influences. Here are 4 things that I want you to think about as it pertains to how we sometimes build our own identity rather than allowing God to build it for us. The first thing is that we build our identity and our sense of self-worth based on personal experiences we have. That is to say, there are some things we experience in life, whether good or bad, and that may determine who we are as an individual and how we live our life out as individuals in this world. For some people, it is a good thing. They were born in successful and prosperous families. They were born to people with money. They were born in certain circumstances or even certain neighborhoods that leads them to think about themselves a certain way. For other people, it's negative. They were born in harsh conditions with less advantages, and they accordingly think of themselves based on those experiences. But then the second thing is we build our identity and our self-worth by the people we hang around. The certain cliques and clubs and people and community members that we are used to being a part of. Those individuals, they help us build our identity. But the third thing is that we build our identity and our self-worth based on the decisions that we've made, whether good or bad. I decided to go to this school or take this job or choose this path in life. Because I did that, then that means I have worth and my identity is based on these things. In fact, I was looking at some of the news yesterday, and I don't know who Clemson played, but obviously they came out well. And there was this feud going back between Clemson and the Gamecocks. Well, we often have these ideologies that are not necessarily inherently a part of who we are, but because of who we attach ourselves to. But then the fourth thing is the influences of external forces, people outside of ourselves. They tend to help us determine and gauge who we are and what our worth really is. Tim Keller wrote a book, and I would encourage, it's a short little book, anyone to pick it up. It's a couple dollars. It's called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. And this is what he stated. He says, long ago in traditional societies, people will build their identity around what the community did. Literally what my tribe, my religion, my family, whatever we were able to accomplish as a society, that's what built my identity. So give you an example. If my father was a carpenter, then I'm going to be a carpenter because that's what our family represents. And we were able to carry the load based on these corporate ambitions rather than our personal and individual ones. But what he stated is that in modern society, and Robert Bella actually confirms this, and this is actually where he gets this from, in modern society, we take the emphasis off of corporate and communal endeavors and we place it on our personal selves. We become more individualistic. And what they conclude is that because we are taking on for ourselves things that people did in community, responsibilities that they did as a group, we're unable to bear it. In fact, we try to do what entire countries did by our own lone works. And we find that we cannot satisfy ourselves and even accomplish those things that they did. And this is what we end up doing. We end up saying that we have low self-worth. In fact, we look for validation out of other people for things we cannot possibly do on our own because we live in a more personal and individualistic society. I'll give you an example of this. I remember when I was 18 years old, I was at Stokes Craven. I don't know if y'all know this, I-95, I think it was exit 98 or something like that. And there was a dealership on the off of I-95 called Stokes Craven Ford, Stokes Craven Chrysler Jeep Dodge. And at that time, at 18 years old, the only thing I ever wanted to do was play the piano. I mean, I would play all day long. I was obsessed with it for personal reasons. It's just who I was. It was my way of staying out of the way. It was a way of me connecting with myself, and I loved doing it. And there was this one gentleman who I won't name in case this goes out somewhere. I decided I was going to call him because he was my major influence. And back then, all of the musicians, they had these websites that included their home phone number on their website, so anyone could call them. So I remember sitting on the showroom floor, and I picked up the phone, and I called this gentleman, and I asked him, I said, hey, I have been hugely influenced by your music. I love your work. Is there anything you can tell me to become a better musician? And he paused and he said, well, thank you for calling, but let me just ask you this one question. I have a book on my website. Did you bother to buy the book? I said, well, no, I didn't. I didn't buy the book yet. I was going to get around to getting there to buy it, but I haven't yet. I just wanted to speak to you. He says, well, don't call me again until you buy my book. He says, if you can't buy my book, it's not worth us having the conversation. And he hung up the phone. Man, my heart was crushed. I was almost in tears on that showroom floor. But as I look back on that instance, my question is, why was that so crushing to me? It is because, here's the key thing, All of us seek validation from forces outside of ourselves. Every one of us in this room, you and I, we all seek validation from somewhere. Maybe it's from a parent, maybe it's from a coworker, maybe it's from your spouse, maybe it's from your children, maybe it's from someone you hold to high esteem. But the issue that we all wrestle with is we oftentimes need to be validated outside of ourselves. And when we don't get that validation, we consider it a huge failure. So one of two things happen. Either we live in that failure, or we seek to push ourselves from being a failure, and we create idols out of those ambitions. This is why I want to talk about this idea of self-forgetfulness. Keller is arguing that we cannot handle the pressure, and this is why we have such anxiety. We have issues with low self-esteem, despair. These lacks of validation, it strikes our ego and our pride. And even at times, it causes us to think we're not worth what God said we're worth. I saw this in a very amateur way, in a very childlike fashion when I went to the movies and watched the latest movie. I think it was called Inside Out 2 with my children. And we were sitting there at the movies, and here we are, and I'm like trying to fight my sleep, because that's typically what I do. I fight my sleep, and my children are always nudging me. Dad, you're sleeping in the theater. You're supposed to be awake. But for some reason, I could not go to sleep on this movie. It is because in this movie, I saw myself and every adult possibly in this room. It is the fact that we, at times, we have to wrestle with our different emotions, not just in a psychological way, but in a very spiritual way. In the movie, Riley was sitting there, and you saw Riley grow up over the stages of her life. But when she became, I guess, a teenager, she was trying to fit in with her counterparts, her friends. And for whatever reason, the group of friends that she was with, she wasn't necessarily satisfied with that. She had to be with the cool kids, like every one of us had to do. When I was in high school, I was not the cool kid. I didn't go to the cafeteria because of social anxiety. It really bothered me. I hated school because I didn't fit in the way that I thought I should. And here she is, she's in this situation. So she does something. She says, I'm going to prove that I am cool, if you will. I'm going to do what I need to do to get the friends that I want. And I remember the scene where she's in practice and she's driven to be cool and fit in with her friends. And she's going to it's this rage, if you will. She's going all over the place, back and forth from goal to goal. And in one scene, she actually knocks over her friend in a way that is almost harmful and offensive. And the coach comes and says, you got to go to timeout, if you will. And in that scene, you have two people on the inside warring for her self-esteem, if you will. Anxiety and joy. I sat there and I looked at that scene, and anxiety didn't say, when she was trying to push Riley to be the best person she could be the best person you could be because you know you can be. Be the best person you can be because that's your personal goal. The motivation for anxiety pushing Riley to be the best she could be was this: you are not good enough. You are not good enough. And I know many people who live in this world who are successful, not because that was their personal ambition, but because they deep down felt they were not good enough. What happens in that situation? Here's my second principle. Our self-constructed identity is, in fact, destructive to our personal peace and our ability to worship God, to do things for God, to glorify God through the things we do. When we use any other motivation to be the best person we think we should be, we are operating off of our self-constructed identity and not the one God created for us. And it's easy to confuse the two. Can I get an amen for somebody? Y'all with me this morning? It's easy to confuse the two, simply because what we often do is very noble and very good. So what does the gospel have to say about this? The text we read today is a part of Israel's hymn book. I love the Psalms because it is real to our lives. It is real to the things we face. And when we look at this psalm, the psalmist has a very important question. What is so valuable about us among all other created things? Why do you consider us so great? In fact, he says, we are just mere mortals. Why should you be thinking about us? We're just human beings that you should care about us. Here's something that we want to think about, and this is what Israel had to face in their mind. They had a covenant relationship with God, like many of us today. And because they were in this covenant with God, they often used that covenant to create an identity that God didn't create for them. Just like we do with our jobs, our professions, our degrees, we can sometimes use religion to create an identity that does not match what God has in mind for us. In Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 16 through verse 19, here's what that identity that God built for them looks like. It says, "Today the Lord your God commanded you to obey all these decrees and regulations. So be careful to obey them today, that the Lord is your God. You have promised to walk decrees, commands, and regulations, and to do everything he tells you. Declare today that you own special treasure, just as he promised, and that you must obey all his commands. And if you do, look at this, if you do all of these things, he will set you high above all the other nations. Then you will receive praise, honor, and renown." Aren't those all